Hello, welcome back to the show. I'm Justin Briley. This is Unbelievable, the programme that aims to bring you interesting conversations every week. And you can find loads more of them over at our podcast if you'd like to subscribe to it. And you can keep up to date with the newsletter as well. And we'll even send you a free ebook for doing that. You can find all of the links in the description from today's video. Welcome along to today's programme. Where is God in all the suffering? We're asking. Serious question, and also the title of Amy Orr-Ewing's new book. Amy is co-director of OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. A new book on this subject is a very practical one on how Christianity speaks to the problem of pain and suffering in all its varied forms. Well, Jon Steingard returns to the show today as well. Jon is the former frontman of the Christian rock band Hawk Nelson. But earlier this year, he announced he no longer really considers himself a Christian. And he actually came on the show to talk that through with Sean McDowell a few months ago. But an important part of that story was some time that Jon spent in Uganda, seeing some of the suffering and deprivation there. And that made him start questioning the character of God. So we're going to be hearing both Jon's story and stories from Amy as well on the show today. They're here to have an honest conversation about suffering and whether we can make sense of it better with or without God. So Amy and Jon, welcome back to the show today.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having us on, Justin.
No, I'm really looking forward to this because, as I say, this is a really tough question, but I feel like both of you have approached it in a really open-hearted kind of way. Maybe we'll start with you, Amy. There are quite a few books out there on this subject. What were you trying to do in adding this particular book? And I suppose coming at a very pertinent time in the midst of 2020.
Yeah, obviously I didn't really realise when I was writing it what 2020 was going to feel like for so many of us. And in a sense, it's been a book I've been writing for 20 years. I'm really trying to draw on multiple experiences of quite extreme suffering, both sort of out there further afield in the world through, volunteering in a slum in East Africa, but also through the experiences of people I know who've experienced sexual violence, child abuse, the murder of a child, all kinds of loss of family members. And it causes you, I think, whether you have a sort of deep, profound religious faith or whether you're uncertain about what you believe, I think an experience of suffering does cause you to question your own deepest assumptions. And so over the last 20 years, it's been a question that's been very real in my own experience. And I wanted to write something that genuinely tried to engage with the intellectual aspect of the question, that really looked at the sort of philosophical dilemma. Could it be possible that a loving God exists and this world be what actually is? And look at some alternatives philosophically to a loving God existing, but not to do that in the abstract, to really try and root it in suffering, and not to do that in a sort of sense of, oh, well, here's a couple of, easy examples, if you like, of suffering that we might be able to just, knock down with a philosophical argument, but to really try and look at some of the harder forms of suffering that we face and see whether the Christian faith has anything to say to that. And also I wanted to draw on the experiences of women. I think a lot of apologetic books are written by men, which is great, but I think that a woman's experience of suffering does also have something to add. And I think actually the Bible uniquely gives voice to the suffering of women in a really profound way. So I wanted to sort of draw that in too. It's been a real journey for me, and it's been a long time coming. Actually resisted writing on this topic for a while because I felt that philosophizing about it can do more harm than good if we're not careful. But that's the heart behind the book, really.
Let me hold it up here. Where is God in all the suffering? It's relatively short, and I was impressed by how much you packed into a very readable and relatively short book, and especially, as you say, all those stories, real life examples. I mean you talked to some extent about the suffering you yourself have experienced, and Frog, your husband.
Yeah.
So you're putting quite a bit of yourself into this book, aren't you?
Yeah, and my husband experienced complex trauma as a result of as a result of abuse as a child, and so I think if you love someone through a recovery process of something that profound, it really changes you. So the other thing I wanted to do, and I felt this is not to criticize other books, I think there are loads of brilliant books out there, but I think sometimes we have a tendency as people of faith to create a sort of blob called suffering, lump it all together, and then try and apply an answer to it. And I wanted to break down, the different experience of grief. If you lose a child or you lose a parent, the grief you go through when you experience loss is different from the suffering of a woman who has been raped or has experienced being hunted and then abused by a man. And that is different from the experience of systemic injustice, where you're caught up in 5 generations of multiple layered suffering. And that's different from an experience of, kind of natural evil. You might experience some sort of random disaster, and all of that is different from the suffering of mental illness. So I'm trying to say, okay, yes, we need to approach this philosophically and intellectually, but do the answers that Christian faith offers, do they actually specifically apply to these different multi-layered personal experiences of suffering?
I found that a really helpful approach, I've got to say. And I found the chapter on mental illness, that's something which really hasn't been explored, especially in apologetics to any great degree, but it's something which is so prevalent in our headlines right now among young people. And most frequently when in a casual context in a church or somewhere, when this issue comes up, it often isn't in some kind of philosophical question. It's why am I feeling depressed? Why am I, and that sort of thing. So I think that's
I sort of open the book trying to say, anyone who's been around a religious community, and obviously my predominant experience is around, Christian communities, churches, although I do have a bit of experience in Islam as well. But anyone who's been around that will have heard someone say, don't ask the question why, just have faith. And that is probably the least helpful answer you could hear if you're struggling with depression or considering ending your life. Or they might hear some sort of guilt-inducing, well, you're going through this depression because you didn't have enough faith, or if you're considering suicide, then there's something wrong with your faith. So I really did want to kind of address that as well in the book. And as you say, questions about mental health. I mean, part of my job is that I kind of go around and try and engage with people's questions about Christian faith, and especially young people. And that question about what does God think about suicide has come up I think in the last 2 years in every event that I've done with young people. It's at the forefront of people's minds. And that's obviously really worrying, but But
why it's so important to address it as well as you do in the book. Thank you so much, Amy. We're also going to hear more about the book, more about some of the examples you draw on in the book, and some of the ways that this engages us both emotionally, philosophically, theologically, and so on. But Jon, welcome back to the program as well. Great to have you back on. You've got up at a ridiculously early time in the morning to join us on the show in California. We're already making you suffer.
It's quite all right. Yeah, it's early over here in California, but I like it. I like it early. So
you're a morning bird. Yes. Well done. Firstly, thanks for coming back. We obviously heard your story in some depth last time you came on the show. That's been a phenomenally popular show, actually. So many views on YouTube, so many people downloading the podcast. So lots and lots of interest, and just a lot of love for the conversation you had with Sean and the way you conducted it. So thank you again for that.
Thank you.
What we started to touch on at the end of that show was one specific area, one thing that started to kind of pull away at the sweater, if you like, of Christian faith, and it was specifically this issue of suffering. So do you just want to take us back to that story of what happened when you were in Uganda this was while you were still with the band and everything, and just describe what that was and what that looked like, and how this issue of suffering really kind of did feed into your own questioning of faith in those days.
Yeah. So in early 2019, I had been engaged in some film work on the side when I was in the band, and that had been growing. And I traveled to Uganda to do some documentary film work for a really small nonprofit that does some work in southwestern Uganda. And they work with this people group called the Batwa, who were indigenous to this area of southwestern Uganda, where the government decided to set up some gorilla sanctuaries. So they sort of set a big area of land aside for gorillas. And it was supposed to sort of encourage tourism and, business and the economy and all that. But the problem was this Batwa people group had lived on this land for generations. They were like a total hunter-gatherer society. They didn't understand, ideas of jobs and money and, modern economy and society and things like that. So they got pushed out and they literally had nowhere to go. And they weren't able to integrate into society. They're pygmies, so that they're only about 4.5, almost 5 feet tall. So they're visibly different than the other people in the area. So it's very easy to discriminate against them. And they just had no way to integrate into society. And so they became, these little encampments, squatting on land wherever they could, a lot of disease, a lot of death. And a lot of children that were orphaned because of that. And so I was, there filming these situations. And I know this is a total cliche for, like a white dude from North America to go to somewhere in Africa and see suffering and have his world rocked. But that's exactly what happened to me. And I saw suffering that I had maybe seen photos or videos of heard stories of before. But when you're confronted with it in person, it's different. And so many of the people that were suffering are these young kids that are, I had just recently become a father myself, and so I was seeing my son in the faces of these kids, and when I encounter a kid who gets found naked and alone and crying in the forest, that's how they'd find these kids. And I experienced that, and it became very difficult for me to reconcile the idea of a loving, powerful God with the things that I saw there. And I think sometimes when I tell this story, people get the idea that I became angry at God, and that's not how I felt at all. How I felt was just that, wow, like given what I see, the idea that God is not there is a much better explanation to me, right, than trying to make sense of how a loving and powerful God could allow something like this. That's what I came away with. And I've definitely thought a lot more about it since then. But Amy, you're completely right that when someone's confronted with an emotional sort of experience like that, sometimes bringing in the philosophy too aggressively can be less than helpful. So I really appreciate that you obviously walked that out in your book really well as well.
It's a really interesting story, and you saying that, and I hadn't quite made the connection last time because I think you talked about this story a bit more briefly last time. But I've been there exactly to the place you mentioned, but the Batwa people, with my wife back in. Oh,
you have?
Yeah, 2001. And we were going as students, well, just after we'd finished university. We went with friends of ours from Oxford University. In fact, it was a trip that was put on by the college chapel that my wife was part of, and the chaplain there had he's no longer with us, but had a relationship with the Anglican Church in Uganda, in that part of Uganda, and they were helping with schoolwork and church and activities, health activities in that part of Uganda. But it was only when you mentioned it then that I thought, yes, of course, that was the same place. So,
oh wow, that's wild. Yeah,
coincidence. But I have a very, very good picture of exactly that group of people that you're talking about there, Jon. But Amy, I mean, you we've been talking about Africa. You, of course, have been to Uganda as well. I don't know if this specific part of Uganda that Jon's mentioned, but you know people who obviously have gone through all kinds of similar situations of one sort or another, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I have been to visit that community as well, in 1998, I think, on the edge of the Burundi impenetrable forest, that region,
yes.
right?
Yeah. That's exactly where it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been to Uganda a number of times, and I really hear what you're saying. I think one of the more kind of formative experiences for me actually was having a student here at OCCA who grew up in one of the largest slums in East Africa. It was called Kalere. It's a slum in Kampala, and getting to know her and hearing her account of what it is like to be a girl child in that specific environment, and the massive scale of sexual exploitation, and seeing all that she's doing. And I think I was struck by what you just said as you spoke. Given what I see, the idea that God is not there is a better explanation. I was really struck by that observation, because I think I would be looking at it slightly differently, and I would be saying, what is it in you, and what is it that you are recognizing in a person from the Batua people, or that I'm recognizing when I see an 11-year-old girl in Kalere? I have no evolutionary predisposition to care about, that whose survival actually doesn't impact me or my children. What is it about their situation that actually causes me to be upset or disturbed? Why does justice matter, and why does a person matter? And as I've sort of explored that question, I've begun to think that our instinct to cry out for justice on behalf of a human being, even someone that we're not directly connected to, says something about what we believe a human being is. And if we're coming at this from an angle of not believing in God, so maybe a materialist or a naturalist worldview, how do we account for that? If human beings are, we're just the collection of atoms, we're the stuff of our body, how do we account for that sacredness that we seem to be perceiving in another human being's life? And the Christian story actually can account for that. It says that human beings are created in the image of God, that whether we believe in him or not, all human beings' life is sacred because it's marked by God's image. And then, of course, as I look at Rachel and I go and work alongside her, and I took my children to go and be with the children in the slum as well, and to experience absolutely extraordinary love, what I would call divine love, being poured out into the lives of these young girls and young people. That impetus to do something, to care, to bring change, to seek justice for the girl child in Uganda, for her is driven by a love for God, God's love for those children, and that belief that their lives really matter, and so it's worth her investing her life in them. So it's a similar sort of set of data, but a different conclusion, that actually our cry for justice points towards God, not away from him.
How do you reconcile that then, Jon?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question, and that's one of the things that I've been contemplating a lot the last few months. So one of the things that I've noticed is, even in the middle of this season of feeling like I'm really struggling to believe in God, at the very least I've lost the image of God that I had, and I, in my mind, I feel like I'm seeking out a true one. I'm seeking out whatever is true and real. And I've noticed in this season that this sort of loss of belief in God has catalyzed an increased desire to participate in the alleviation of suffering, not a decrease. And so I've wondered the same thing. Well, why does this matter to me? Why does Why does the suffering bother me? And one of the things that I've tried to study a lot is sort of evolutionary psychology, and go like, why do we as human beings think the way that we think? And, is it possible that empathy is something that we developed because it has a social, benefit and can benefit us as groups? We're incredibly social creatures, human beings. And so, does empathy itself, sort of the development of empathy evolutionarily, does that explain these things that I'm feeling? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I sort of sometimes wonder if Christianity is an expression that we sort of worked out to frame the things that we're already feeling, So I actually, one of the things I was struck by in your book is how often you make the argument that Christianity is beneficial. And that's one that I actually somewhat agree with. And because I come away from some of these parts in your book and some of these issues going like, well, true or not true, there does seem to be some benefit to framing suffering in a Christian perspective. It can help you, if it can help you shoulder the burden of suffering and make life more manageable, then that's a good thing. But it doesn't necessarily follow that it's literally true. And so that's one of the things that I've sort of been processing recently. And I don't have a clear position on, if I'm being honest.
Yeah,
sure.
It's a good point to make, I suppose, Amy. I mean, 2 points there, really. John wonders whether there could be an evolutionary sort of explanation, the empathy that we may feel, kinship, and that we sort of frame that in a Christian framework. And it may be that that's a very good way of increasing that aptitude and cohering a society and helping us deal personally with pain and loss, but doesn't necessarily mean it's actually true, that there is a God ultimately who loves us and so on. So where would you begin with that?
Wow. I think on the first point, could there be an evolutionary explanation for empathy? I think that I'm trying to make it deeper, sounds like a pejorative word, sorry, but I'm trying to make a slightly different point. Not that we feel pity for people who suffer, because obviously not everybody does, but I think lots of people do. But I think that we feel something more as human beings than empathy and pity. So one of the examples that I use in the book comes from a British situation where there was a tower block in London called Grenfell Tower, and it was social housing predominantly. It was a tall building, and the building had sort of cladding put on the outside of it because it's in one of those strange neighbourhoods in London where there's a lot of wealth around, but there are pockets of deprivation. And to make the building look nicer, basically for the rich people down the road, this cladding was put on. But unfortunately, the cladding actually had an effect of fire accelerant. And so when the building caught fire, the fire took hold and a lot of people died, including children. And it was utterly devastating. We all watched it on TV. And through a sort of various circumstances, my husband, who's a pastor, was invited to come and lead a kind of, I guess, public act of commemoration and worship on the Sunday morning. So the fire started on the Thursday night. And, so we're talking about just a few days. So we're standing outside, over 1,000 people came to this. We did it in the street, actually outside. And it was just unbelievable. Lots of people who had relatives and, children who died in the fire were there. And so we're there, and a psalm is read, Psalm 147, about how God is close to the brokenhearted. And then the psalm goes on, someone's just reading it out. And bear in mind, most of the people there would not be churchgoers, wouldn't be people who would particularly read the Bible. But this verse comes in that psalm which talks about how the wicked will be thrown to the ground. And the reader was continuing on to read, but the whole crowd erupted in applause at this idea that there might be accountability for the wicked.
Mm-hmm.
And standing, looking at a smoking building in which, you know, in a modern Western democratic society, people have burned to death, partly as a result of being poor, there was this overwhelming sense that we wanted justice, that people wanted accountability for what had happened. And that was for people who felt personally connected, but for everyone. And I found that extraordinary. It went beyond empathy. There was a deep sense that what has happened is wrong, profoundly wrong, that the loss of life was deeply and profoundly wrong. And to me, the description of a Hebrew poet from, you know, thousands of years ago, that just resonated with people who didn't have a particular predisposition to believe in God and weren't religious, was really interesting. And it spoke to me of how actually our anger and our outrage, even at God, in the face of the injustice that we see in the world, is described by the Bible, and it is also accounted for by a Christian way of seeing the world and what it means to be human, that we're not just a collection of atoms and cells. We haven't just evolved to experience pity or empathy, but that actually life is sacred and it really matters when life is taken away. And so that instinct for justice, whether we believe in God or not, I think is an imprint of the image of God in us as human beings. And I think it's best explained by that as well. But yeah, obviously a different perspective from you. But for me, that was
it's a very powerful moment in the book when you describe that scene.
I agree.
And I was stopped in my tracks, because we normally, if we're honest, Amy, we often skip over the bits where God's doing a bit of judging in the Psalms, don't we?
Yeah.
And yet that was the bit that spoke most to people, because it was about justice for wrongdoing, and that has obviously been a very keen theme from the Grenfell inquiry, which has obviously been huge here in the UK, maybe not so well known out in the USA. But Jon, this idea of justice, that there's a kind of justice that we instinctively feel needs to be answered, but perhaps is harder to justify on a purely naturalistic understanding of the world. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I actually remember when that happened, because it was on the news over here as well. And when I read that part of the book, I was thinking about that too, because I mean, obviously you being sort of present there made that experience come alive for you in a way that it wouldn't have for me, because I wasn't there, right? And so that kind of got me thinking about the way we react to horrible atrocities. And you know, if we hear about something horrible happen, very often our first gut reaction is like, oh, that's horrible. And we might think about it for a minute, and then we sort of go on with our lives. And then if we're shown pictures, our reaction might be increased, right? And then if we're shown video, our reaction might go up. And then if we're physically there, our reaction might be more. And then if we know someone that happened to, then again, our reaction might be more. So emotionally, there's these degrees of how much we react to things based on how connected to them we are. But overlaid on top of that is this belief that we should be equally outraged regardless of whether it's someone we're connected to that was harmed or someone that we don't know. But I think there's two different things going on there. I think there's this reason, this layer of reason that we have overlaid on top of our sort of emotional reaction. And when you remove that sort of that sense of reason, because that is something that we're doing consciously, going, oh, you know what, I should care equally regardless of how connected I am to this situation. If you sort of remove that, our true response is totally geared by how connected we are to these situations, which is why it's, you know, for organizations that are trying to raise money, it's more effective to show people pictures and video than it is to just tell a story. You know, if you can do it all, you can get people more connected. And to me, that's sort of evidence of you know, empathy at work, and an empathy and a sense of caring for other people that is very much rooted in how connected we are to them.
We'll go to a quick break. We'll go to a quick break if that's okay. I hate to break into what is a fascinating conversation. I'd be fascinated to hear your response to that. That there is evidence that there is a sort of, this empathy is ultimately about how connected we feel to people in situations. You're listening to Unbelievable. We're talking about Where is God in All the Suffering? It's the title of Amy Orr-Ewing's new book. She's talking with Jon Steingard on the program today about it.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like, yes, like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were like too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to today's show here on Unbelievable. Today, we're asking one of the most fundamental questions and one of the most common objections to Christianity. Where is God in all the suffering? It's the title of Amy Orr-Ewing's new book. I'll make sure there are links to her, the book, and of course to Jon Steingard, our other guest on the program today, if you go and look for the info from today's show. Jon's already spoken about how the issue of suffering came alive for him, really, while he still considered himself a Christian, but when it really pressed some important questions on him about the character of God while he was out in Uganda, and it's led us into a discussion on a situation close to home for us, Amy, the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and that sense of justice that you felt people expressed when you were part of that commemoration service the Sunday afterwards, that instinctive need. Jon says, but couldn't we still give that a sort of an evolutionary explanation? People do feel much more connected when we're there, when we're connected, when we see the pictures, or, you know, charities know what it takes to get people to empathize. It takes sending them a video and make them feel like they're more connected to that person than who otherwise, and let's all face it, it's true, there are many things, terrible tragedies that we don't have the same kind of reaction to because they feel far away and disconnected from us. So what? Yeah, you wanted to come in and say something in response.
Sorry, yeah, I was just wanting to come in there and saying, I think I'm trying to say something different from perhaps what it sounds like, because I'm not really trying to say that empathy or our feelings about a particular incident make them wrong. I'm trying to say that our human reaction to great injustice, including that of those we have no evolutionary predisposition to care about, points to something more deeply true about reality, that certain things are actually wrong, whether we regard them as wrong or not, and that a violation of a human being or someone being burned in a fire because of great profoundly wrong, whether we feel pity about them or not. And this sort of also relates to something else that I draw out a little bit in the book. John Gray, who's a sort of leading atheist here in Britain, points out that before Christian morality, the idea of not being cruel to someone else just wasn't around. That the desire to not be cruel is a sort of heritage of theistic, Christian and Jewish inheritance. So we kind of take it for granted. But when we look at other worldviews or other systems, so for example, in the 1940s here in Britain, people like C.S. Lewis and Dorothy L. Sayers were working in a context where there's a whole different set of assumptions about what good and evil are, who you should empathize with and who you should not. And Sayers, for example, noticed that that a kind of British way of looking at the world was quite different from what Nazism was proclaiming, that there was still this idea of something good in Nazism, but it was a will to power. And it was the idea that mercy and charity were effeminate and that war was more desirable than peace. So at the end of the day, I suppose I'm trying to say that it's not so much what our individual feelings are about a certain situation. It's about whether morality actually exists in objective terms, and whether our instincts as human beings are pointing us towards that there's a coherence to reality about what we feel about it and what it actually is, and that's pointing us towards God, rather than empathy or pity in a particular situation that one person may or may not feel, and you need to show them a film to make them feel it more, and that therefore makes it more wrong. That's a slightly different way of looking at the world.
A quick response, Jon, and then I'd love to move us on to sort of talking about sort of, as it were, from this kind of more metaphysical question of, is there no, it's fine. I think it's important to do that groundwork, but then obviously it still leaves the question of why would God, even if we do see that there's this objective nature to human value and everything else, why wouldn't God step in and nevertheless change things for the good of people? But Jon, quick response, and then
quick response there. I actually, in studying the 20th century, I do actually agree with pretty much everything you just said. I mean, I think that, and I've experienced this in my own life in a personal way, when you sort of lose your faith in God, both individually and as a society, there is a bit of a compass that you've lost. And, that was one of the things Nietzsche was concerned about, and I think he made a really good point, in that section of his book where he talks about the death of God. And I think sometimes and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but I think sometimes some Christians look at that, bit of Nietzschean thought as like he was celebrating the death of God, and he really wasn't. No. He was concerned about what happens to a society when we lose that belief, and hopeful that we could replace it with something, but a little bit terrified about what happens in the interim. And I think the 20th century has a lot of examples of ways that as humanity, we really got that wrong. I mean, if you look at the Soviet gulags, if you look at Nazi, fascism, and if you look at, one thing that we don't hear a lot about is that there were probably about 100 million people that died in Maoist China. And those are all examples of sort of experiments of what happens when we don't value human life. And it's horrifying. So I'm sort of with you on that concern.
Well, in that sense, then it does lead us naturally to the next question. If say for the sake of argument, we were to grant that there is even some objective sense of justice that needs to be answered, I guess the question for you, Amy, next that Jon is asking in the context of these Ugandan children and the Batwa people is, why would God allow that to happen? Why, if God is, it's a classic question, if God is all good, all powerful, I think you could compare it to your own feelings as a father, Jon. You would never allow, if you could do something about your children being in that state, you wouldn't let that continue. So why does God, essentially?
Yeah, that's sort of, I think for me, that's the most potent formulation of the question is like what, for me, as someone who loves my kids, I recognize that they're going to have to face some trials in life. That's part of life, and sometimes some of those trials and struggles are going to be part of making them who they can become, which can be a positive thing. But there's limits to how much suffering I'm really like prepared to like voluntarily let them, you know, experience. And so much of the suffering I see in the world, when looked through that lens, I'm just like, for me as a father, I don't know that I could stand by and just let that happen.
It seems unnecessary that whatever God's greater purposes may be, it doesn't seem to warrant this kind of the way the world is in so many parts of it. I mean, again, this is kind of at the center of the book, really, Amy. So where do you want to begin with this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as Justin says, this is really at the center of the book. Classically, the way that Christians sort of approach this question is to ask the question about love and what makes love possible. And I know you touched on this a bit with Sean, so I don't want to spend too long on it, but perhaps for those who are listening as well, to say that, you know, you have alternative ways of looking at this question. We could look through an Eastern mindset, through that lens of karma, where people get what they deserve, that there's this sort of inherent justice in the universe, and so when we suffer, we draw the conclusion that we've done something to deserve it. Or we can look through a materialist worldview where there is no God, and that the suffering that happens it's random, it's meaningless, it's down to chance, perhaps down to the strong eliminating the weak as well. You could throw that one in there, but we can't really ask why. We're just here, it just is. And so even that instinct to ask why is sort of suppressed by those two alternative ways of looking at the question. So I would want to start by saying that I think that the Bible is unique in actually encouraging us to ask why, including how can you let this be happening, God? Where are you? Why are you taking so long to answer our prayers? You know, how has the world gone so wrong? And do I even believe in you? All of those questions are actually articulated in the Bible. So I think that's a sort of interesting starting point. And then the way that the Bible sort of approaches this is to present a case, if you like, that God actually does exist, and that God is loving, and that he's created a world in which love is possible. And he's created human beings in his image. We've talked about this image of God theme, but I think this is the sort of one of the centrally unique assertions of the Christian faith, that human life is uniquely precious and sacred because we bear the image of God. And that means that we have the capacity to love, and that means the capacity to choose. So one of the stories I tell in the book, actually, to try and, I guess, bring out, because again, that can sound like philosophical categories, that can sound a bit like wordplay, but one of the stories I tell is when I was 15, I had a friend who was 15, and she came from a different cultural background, and one day her parents told her, we found the person you're going to marry, and they'd arranged it, and he was going to be brought in from outside Britain to marry her. And I remember the conversations with this girl as she thought about her life, and she thought, I want to please my parents, I want to be in my community, I want to be accepted, but I have this very deep feeling that I am capable of love and of choosing somebody. And the idea that, you know, you would get married to someone you've never met and then have sex on your wedding night, basically against your will, was utterly terrifying to her. And she actually decided to escape that relationship. Her cousin had done the same thing 3 months before, and the family had found her, knocked her down in the street with a car and taken her out of the country, and she'd been married off against her will. So from a sort of female teenage perspective, the idea that love and choice are actually integral to each other is something very powerful that I know to be true in the deepest place that I know of in my, in my inner person. I know that love cannot be compelled. And I think that idea is really central to the Bible's explanation of the world that we live in, that God makes a world in which love is possible. We're not robots. We have choice. And therefore we have the ability and capacity to love, which actually brings all of the beautiful and meaningful experiences that we have access to as human beings. But unfortunately, it also entails the pain and suffering that we see. And so the Bible then describes reality that you and I experience, where terrible things do happen to people who don't deserve it, where there are all these consequences to human selfishness. It doesn't deny that reality, but there's this kind of undergirding explanation of how it can be as it is. And then I guess to your question, why doesn't God just intervene if he's a loving father and stop all of these things happening? And I think ultimately the answer to that is that if he did that, that would actually remove our volition, and it would ultimately remove love from the world. And so we don't have a God who presses the delete button and the reset button constantly. And we also don't have a God who remains distant from this suffering world and sort of observes it with either empathy or pity. In Christ, he ultimately enters the suffering and is prepared to do that himself. So
it's a great starting point, and I'd love to hear some response to Jon, because I think this is often where we begin. And in the philosophical, literature, it's called the free will defense. It's this idea that freedom is a great good, but it comes at a great cost, in a sense that our ability to love means we can choose not to love, and we can choose to make all of those decisions that result in a world of haves and have-nots as well. But if God simply intervened every time, we would no longer, as Amy says, have volition. We would become robots, in a sense, and not have the things that make us truly human, the ability to choose to love, or indeed to withhold love. So where would you be in with that one, Jon?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think there's a lot there that I resonate with. And when I look at scripture, I'm really comforted by the fact that it's obvious that the questions I'm asking are not new. And there's a long history of people asking those questions, right? I mean, like a third or half of the Psalms are laments. And so, even you look at the book of Job, and that entire book is trying to make sense of suffering. And so sometimes I wonder, like when I look at scripture, or I look at Christian thought or whatever, it's a bit the chicken and the egg to me. It's like, okay, so does this explain the origins of suffering, or were we suffering as human beings, and then we started to create ideas as to why that might be? And if you look at Greek mythology, so much of that is trying to explain suffering, because it's like, the gods are angry at us and we got to please the gods and all this stuff. And there's aspects of Christianity that remind me of that, especially in the Old Testament. For people like myself, like when I started struggling experientially with some of the sort of suffering questions, and started digging into scripture, I found a lot of things that were helpful. And then I found a lot of things that made things so much worse. Or so it seemed like, some of the issues surrounding slavery in the Old Testament, and God appearing to not only condone it, but to command it. One of the other things that I notice is in Genesis 3, talking about the expulsion from Eden, it does sort of really explicitly appear that God cursed humanity with suffering as a punitive measure. It doesn't seem worded to me to be the kind of thing where it's like, this is a result of it is the result of Adam and Eve's actions, but it feels punitive, not like a natural result of their actions. Even talking about childbirth in Genesis 3 verse 16, I think it is, where it says, God explicitly states that he is going to make childbirth painful. And so I look at things like that and I go, okay, like it seems like we were already suffering, and then we searched for a reason as to why that was. And plenty of people have drawn the conclusion over the years that it's because God does exist and he's angry. and I could see how people back then would draw those conclusions, and or even today.
Yeah, Amy.
Yeah, well, to sort of untangle a few thoughts from that, really, thank you, Jon, for your response there. I mean, the first thing I think I would say about the description in Genesis 3 of the fall is that in the biblical literature, there is a close relationship between human moral accountability and God's judgment. And so a consequence of us having choice and having then accountability for that choice is that that God, who is judge between good and evil, articulates his judgment in a particular way in chapter 3, but there's a close connection between the idea of consequence of what we've done and that judgment. So it's not sort of seen as arbitrary. And the particular example you gave about women in pain in childbirth, obviously I've been through that, so
yes, I have
experience.
to I was about to say, I feel like that particular issue is a really dangerous one for me to bring up, because I don't obviously have that experience, and you do, and you had twins too, right?
Yeah, first time round had twins. However, actually the Hebrew word there, talking about a woman in labor, actually denotes all labor, all work. So there's a sort of more profound theological point going on, because obviously Adam's work had been agricultural, and so you see this fracturing of the relationship between the person and the land, the thorns and thistles, and then Eve as the mother, the predominant work that she was doing at that point was bringing forth children. But actually the Hebrew word denotes all work, so it's about a kind of fundamental alienation that is going to affect women who don't have children in their work, and men who don't happen to be agricultural workers in their work. So we're looking at how the choice that the man and the woman make has a direct impact, not just on each other, not just on their relationship with God, but also on humanity's relationship with the environment, and actually with a sense of vocation and work. And so you're right, the writer of Genesis speaks about it as God's curse falling, but it's very directly a consequence, and of our exercise of our choice. That's how the text is kind of, and then goes on to unfold, that we see this sort of accumulation of consequence as we see the results through history. So one of the things I guess I'd want to ask you is, because I feel like what you're saying is it's almost too good a description of reality that we have in the Bible. So haven't we just come up with it as an explanation for what we're going through, rather than it actually being true and it describing reality? That's a really interesting point that you make, and it's not a point that many other people make. Usually the challenge is it doesn't make sense.
Right. No, I think I see, to a large degree, I see a lot of utility in a lot of Christian ideas, and I also have come to realize over the past few months that by nature of growing up in Christianity, and by nature of growing up in the West in general, it's almost impossible for me to extricate myself from Christian ideas. And in studying history, I agree with you. Like, pre-Christianity, the idea that cruelty was a problem just wasn't very common. And so, I think, Justin, I think you and I had both noticed Tom Holland's sort of change in views on this issue. And I agree. I think that's one of the things that I'm wrestling with right now is I see a lot of good things about Christianity at the same time as I'm sort of wrestling with whether I really believe it.
I mean, one of the interesting, points that Tom Holland brings out several times and has done in debates that I've hosted with him here on Unbelievable is that in an ironic way, we often judge Christianity's failings by the fact that we've inherited its values, by the fact that we judge when Christianity gets it wrong, because we hold this particular value system that itself has come from our Christian heritage. So there's this kind of interesting loop that's going on there. And to some degree, the very fact that you're got a problem with God is partly because of the Judeo-Christian society you've been brought up in, which kind of says this isn't the way the world should be, in a funny way, Jon. I guess, aside from the specifics of those passages in Genesis, though, that would be a really interesting sort of thing to continue to pursue. It leaves me with this question for you, Jon, of, you have had your, if you like, if you allow me to term it, a crisis of faith, having known your Bible very well. You've been a lifelong Christian in many ways. And I suppose coming back to that question we discussed a bit with Sean is why now? Why was it that particular situation that suddenly caused this to be a problem, when obviously generations upon generations of Christians in much harder circumstances all over the world have nevertheless trusted in God, in spite of, actually being in those difficult circumstances. And I would again go back, I suppose, to my experience of being among the Baptist people, and seeing the same things that you saw. But I also saw, I suppose, the way there was so many people that I knew of in these mission organizations, the Anglican Church there, were trying to make a big difference in that. And they saw themselves as being the answers to some of those problems. That, for me, feels like a natural Christian response, if I may say. And it's just interesting that in that circumstance, I didn't see many people there faced with it every day who were actually having the same response as you have had to that situation. People were actually responding as Christians and not seeing that God was somehow to blame in this situation.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, and I've noticed sometimes when people suffer, it seems to draw them closer to God, and sometimes it seems to drive them away, and I've wondered a lot about why that might be, I do think that there's this propensity for us to always want explanations for things. And I think when it comes to suffering, that's one of the reasons why it's a hard question, is because there aren't easy answers. It's not that there aren't any responses out there to suffering. And Amy, you've done a great job of putting a whole book together of, thoughts around this issue, and it's a really good approach. And I sort of just wonder, do some people seek the explanation so much that they get obsessed with diving deep into these issues like I am, or do some people, would they rather have the resolution of taking that answer that they're given and going, that's good enough for me, I'm going to go ahead and live my life? Because I can speak from experience that diving deep into these issues the way that I am and wrestling with them the way that I am isn't comfortable. And I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with someone and I've thought it would be easier to just believe this and to stop fighting it. And I actually I read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce again last weekend, because it's my favorite book of all time, and C.S. Lewis is my favorite author still. And I'm struck by this idea of the fact that there is suffering regardless of why, and I can choose to believe that life is still worth it. I think it was Camus that said the only philosophical question worth pondering is whether or not to commit suicide, which is super dark. But he's talking about a really important issue. Okay, there is suffering in the world. Does the goodness and the experience of life justify the suffering? And that's a really good question. And to me, the existential sort of approach to that is well, live your life in such a way that it's worth it. And that's kind of what I'm sort of the approach that I'm sort of starting to take now. Like, I don't know if I can explain the suffering, but it's here. And how do I respond? That's kind of where I'm at right now.
We're going to go to a quick break. Amy, I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off at every turn here. Just as you hold that thought, we're going to come back very shortly, talking about the problem of pain and suffering today. Really fascinating, very open-hearted and generous conversation, I think, on the show today between Amy Orr-Ewing and Jon Steingard, my guests here on Unbelievable. We'll be back very shortly.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
I've just been so enjoying, if that's the right word, this conversation on suffering. I know that's an odd thing to say, but it's very often this can be very philosophical, you know, and we've done those shows, I can assure you, on Unbelievable. But this feels like a really kind of genuine, open-hearted, kind of honest exploration of these subjects between you both, Amy and Jon. So thank you for the way that you've done this conversation. Again, links to both of you, the book that Amy's written from the show today, where you can find out more about Jon as well. I had to interrupt you there, Amy. So just come back with that thought you were going to give us on the back of Jon.
So we were talking, Jon was talking about Camus and whether there's kind of purpose in life, and it just struck me that Jon's gospel talks about Jesus saying, "In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind, of all people." And I guess for the Christian, we are offered the prospect of relationship with the source of life and an experience of life in this dark world, in the real world where all these terrible things that we've been talking about happen. But there's a sort of exquisitely beautiful prospect that a loving God does exist and has actually revealed himself in the person of Jesus, and that you and I can experience relationship with him that Jesus describes as akin to being born, like coming to know God and experiencing that capital L life is like being born all over again. And if that is true, then life really is worth living in multicolor or multiple dimensions, and it is worth pursuing the question of whether that is actually true, whether God does exist, and his offer of relationship with us. And I think that the fact that Jesus chooses willingly to suffer and to go through the most excruciating pain known to man in the ancient world, but also to identify with us. You know, the Old Testament calls him the suffering servant, that integral to who Jesus is direct experience of horrific pain and shame and abuse and betrayal and all of the different kinds of pain that we can go through, and that God's love is expressed and demonstrated through Christ's suffering. I think that's something really beautiful and something deeply true, both historically and evidentially, but also existentially, that it's a truth that resonates with what it actually means to be human.
Well, I'd be interested in your response to that, Jon, and especially in a way, this is where Amy's book lands, the person of Jesus, and in that person that, you know, obviously Christians believe he is God in human flesh, but that God himself takes on pain, suffering, humiliation, betrayal, all of those things that are part of, you know, what it is to suffer in this life, and that somehow doesn't necessarily provide an answer to why, but it certainly provides huge consolation to many people who are going through suffering, and speaks to something obviously very deeply to someone like Amy about what's at the center of this, that this isn't a God who is abstract or standing far off.
Yeah. I actually, in thinking about that, you know, I really appreciate the way that you worded the title of your book, because to me it links sort of the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering, with the idea of divine hiddenness, right? Which as I've been looking at my own thought process, I think that is potentially one of the bigger issues for me, is the sort of like, well, where, if God is real, like, where is he? And I grew up in a very charismatic environment where like a personal relationship with Jesus was like, that had primacy over, that was the most important thing. And I remember always sort of struggling to go like, well, am I really talking to Jesus, or am I sort of talking to my own mind? I mean, when an idea pops into my head, is that the Holy Spirit, or is that me? And that's something that I know is central to my struggle, and wondering how, was that ever real for me? Is it real for other people? What's the difference between psychological and spiritual, But on the Jesus point, I remember having this thought, like, okay, so God is all powerful, all loving, created the universe, created all this beauty. I was just in Montana and was up in the mountains, and it was just gorgeous. And I remember having that thought, like, this beauty, how could this just be random? Then thinking about the person of Jesus, like you brought up, I find myself, this is one of the things I've contemplated over the last, 6 or 8 months or a year, is that if God, an unlimited, all-powerful, all-loving being, if he could create reality to be whatever he wanted, then why would he create a reality in which it was necessary for his own son to suffer and die like that? Now it could be that he just understands suffering better than I do. Like, that is a plausible answer. But it sort of stands to me to like, it's difficult for me to explain why God would make it so.
And I guess for me, that comes the answer to, or what I would begin to sort of answer that with, would be to come back to what love actually is, and whether love is possible without freedom. And so love entailing freedom, and therefore love entailing the possibility of pain, is the reality we are in. And it's the reality that God is then prepared himself to step into, that he is prepared to actually suffer, not just observe suffering, not just diagnose it, and not just even empathize with it, but to actually enter it. And that, I think, really undergirds the reality of that statement, that God is love. He is actually prepared to bear the cost of love, which is pain, himself.
Yeah, and I think that kind of actually brings us back to a similar point that we got to with our conversation with Sean, Justin, that then I come back to the idea of heaven, and I go, well, I doubt that you would say that there won't be love in heaven, but it also doesn't seem like sin is present in heaven, and suffering is not present in heaven, and so I've heard some philosophical arguments as to how that can be, but it feels strange to me that here on earth we connect love so directly with free will, and we also connect sin so directly with free will. But it seems like in heaven we're supposed to have free will and love, but there won't be sin, and that the explanations I've heard for that have never really satisfied me.
Why can't we just have that now rather than have to wait?
Well, why not? Yeah. Why not start? Right, sure. Why not start there?
Yeah.
Well, classically, the sort of answer to that is that heaven is accessed via choice being exercised. So obviously, it's accessed by Jesus giving his life, but that is not imposed on us. That forgiveness is not imposed on us. And so it's a bit like, I was trying to think of an analogy, and I wondered whether the analogy of adoption might be helpful. A child becomes the daughter of my friend because my friend makes that choice and the courts grant that adoption. So she doesn't need to choose to be adopted, or choose to adopt that child every single day. that relationship that is established in that moment of adoption then goes on from that day forward, but it's predicated on that choice, on that decision that was made. And so I think again, to go back to the analogy that Jesus uses of what it actually means to come to know God is like a birth. When we mentioned my twins before, my first experience of birth, I went into hospital with my husband. There were 2 of us. When we left, there were 4 people. It's like something ontological happens that is very, very profound and real. And that's the image that a Middle Eastern 30-year-old single male chooses to use to describe what it means to come to know God and to have eternal life, which is ultimately talking about heaven. So the loving relationship that begins, that goes on, because Jesus says, when you're born again, eternal life starts now. That ontological change has happened, and then it transcends our death. We go to be with him in heaven. And so that loving moment, that covenant, if you like, happens as a result of choice, and then it's not actually undone by an exercise of will in eternity, but choice is nonetheless utterly essential to it actually being possible. So that's historically, classically how Christians would understand that. Other people might say, well, couldn't God just have not created at all? Wouldn't it have been better for him not to create? And again, I talk about this at the end of the book. There's a philosophical problem with that, because we're comparing existence with non-existence and saying one would be better. We can't really do that. And another analogy we might use is, again, birth, the decision to bring a child into the world. You've done it and I've done it, and we made a choice out of love for our partner and love for that future child to bring a child into the world. But you and I both know without a shadow of a doubt that baby that we had will suffer and will die. And yet we went ahead. In other words, love did not stop us bringing life into the world. It did not stop us going ahead and creating that child. And on one level, we can never know how and why God did it, but we do know how and why we did it. And I think that is a picture if we bear the image of God.
And I think that's a powerful example, because I've thought about that through that lens exactly. Like, okay, so the fact that I'm still here indicates that I believe life is worth living. Right? Otherwise, I wouldn't continue to do it. And the fact that I've had children indicates, you and I, all of us have children, and that sort of indicates that we deeply believe life is worth living. And so I agree with you on that point, and I continue to be curious about exactly how all of that is grounded.
Look, it's been such a good discussion. So interesting. Thank you. Just as we close out, I'd just be interested in engaging from you, Jon, as we close. Is this an issue kind of that you feel needs to be resolved before you could potentially approach the kind of the idea of believing in God again? I'm sure it's bound up with many other issues as well.
Yeah. I've thought about that a lot, and I don't think it's going to be resolved exactly. At least I don't see a resolution really on the horizon, other than acceptance of sort of what we just talked about, and going like, well, I don't totally understand why we suffer the way we do, or why people suffer the way they do. But I still, by very nature of being here and continue to be here, I believe that life is worth it. And so I came home from this trip this weekend, and I told my wife, I was like, I think I have a new lens through looking at this. And I've been saying the phrase like submit to being. And maybe I've got some hangups with the word God, but I feel like I'm ready to submit to being, being capital B. Like life is what it is. Reality is what it is. And there's so much, like we've all agreed, there is so much good in it that I feel like I'm sort of prepared to take the good with the bad, because I think that's my only good option. You know, and seek out, sort of continue to seek out the answers as to what that means.
Amy, any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just encourage you as well to be open to that capital B being actually existing and having that potential of that new birth, that relationship with God through Christ. And we haven't really talked about church or experiences of church or kind of Christian culture, but one thing I would sort of want to encourage you to explore is kind of God beyond the American church scene that you may have experienced, and to continue to be open to him existing, him loving you, him loving your children and family, and the possibility of relationship with him through Christ.
Guys, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been really, really interesting. Jon, it's been really good to catch up with you again. And I'm as usual, just so encouraged by the way you approach these topics with openness, wanting to have a genuine conversation. I hope maybe we can catch up again.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's great to do that.
Yeah. And Amy, I think that like, this is such an important topic, and I'm so grateful that people like you are addressing it, because I don't feel like I experienced a lot of that growing up, and so many people have these questions, and the fact that you're addressing them head on and not skidding around the fringes of them is fantastic.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for the engagement, and I hope we've got each other's email addresses, so I hope we can continue, because it's a really important conversation. Thank you for your openness and kindness as well.
You might not be quite close enough as Sean is to go actually running with Jon in California, but
we've taken to doing that. Yeah, Sean and I about once a month have been going running together recently.
That's
so
great.
I love it when I hear of a friendship developing from a show. That's always a good sign. Well, look, thank you so much, both. And I will make sure to have both of your information from today's show. If you want more on Amy and the book, Where is God in All the Suffering? It's published by the Good Book Company. Then do go and check that out with the info from today's show. And I'll make sure there's links to Jon as well, and where you can find out more about him. But for now, Amy and Jon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.